Welcome to the Hope and Wholeness Podcast, where we empower people to seize the day and flourish in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Duckworth, and I'm thrilled to have you aboard. I'm a disciple of Jesus, psychologist, husband, father, coach, real estate investor, and passionate mountain biker, and I'm here to walk alongside you. My mission? To infuse hope and foster wholeness into every aspect of your life. Each episode will give you a bird's eye view of authentic discussions on real life issues, followed by practical suggestions. Let's tackle your toughest questions and embark on this journey together. All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Hope and Wholeness Podcast. I'm Dr. Ryan, and today I've got a good friend with me, my friend Joel Wilkinson.
Yep.
Joel is a licensed master social worker, and we've been friends for how many years now?
Did we meet in 08 or 09?
It was sometime before I graduated undergrad, so yeah, it was definitely, it's been
a little bit.
14 years or 15 years, something like that. And now Joel works with us as a therapist at Hope and Wholeness Psychology Center.
Yep.
So today we're just going to be having a conversation, and we're going to let you guys in on a conversation that we have. And Joel and I have good conversations all the time about all kinds of good stuff. Normally we don't have enough time to finish those conversations, but today we're going to try to.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk a little bit about Joel's work with substance use and recovery, and we are going to talk about some stuff that's going to be helpful if you're in recovery. We're going to talk about some stuff that will be helpful if you know somebody in recovery. We're going to talk about stuff that's going to be helpful if you are struggling with an addiction. And if you don't know anybody, we're still going to talk about stuff that's going to be helpful for you, because Joel has this theory that everyone's in recovery. And so I'm really excited for him to share some about that today. So yeah, Joel, why don't you introduce yourself, say a little about where you're coming from today.
Yeah, so I'm Joel Wilkinson, as you said. I'm a master in social work, as you said. I'm also, I carry a certification, a credential, which is a CAADC. It's Certified Advanced Addiction and Drug Counselor. Mm-hmm. It's something that's required for anybody who's going to work within a licensed facility. A lot of times there's contracts and stuff involved with that. But what that's basically saying is I love to work with people who are struggling with addiction. And I don't say addicts, I don't say users, I don't say those sorts of things. Like, there's a lot of pejoratives, even within the addiction community, of what labels are, right? Gotcha. So one of my mentors in grad school said, you're going to run into clients, you're going to run into residents, you're going to find addicts, you're going to find patients, but ultimately you always have to remember to call them people. I think that's something that is very difficult. I'm going to talk about some statistics briefly, and no one's a statistic. It's not a number, it's real people. Yeah. So when we're talking, whether it's an overdose statistic or dealing with substance use disorder, I hope I'll try not to use too many acronyms when I talk, but I'll say SUD, and that means substance use disorder. It just truncates a little bit of the conversation. But there's a very long story into getting into that. I'm not even sure if I've told you all of it. But a little bit about myself is I also like to be pretty forward with saying that I'm a person of faith. I'm a Christian. So
Joel, tell us your definition of recovery, and just tell us your definition of recovery.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. A lot of people think of recovery as sobriety. And I think there's a distinction between being sober, being abstinent from something, and being in recovery. So the idea behind the recovery definition is, in fact, I could pull up the SAMHSA definition, because actually on the NIH website, on the MDHHS website, and the SAMHSA, those are all agencies that deal with addiction. They actually define it as this, and I wanted to pull it up for that reason, because I think I completely agree with it, obviously, but there's, coming from kind of the recovery perspective, I think there's a slight nuance there. So according to SAMHSA, recovery is a process of change through which people improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. Kind of goes with some very near and dear things to me. There's scripture that talks about abundant life. Mm-hmm. There's this hope for everybody that, we have the American dream. We have, what does your dream look like? What are some goals? What are some needs in life? And then it also kind of flies in the face of what many people who don't understand addiction think it is. So some so what people might think it is, well, you're just sober, you're clean, you go to AA, and that's it, right? Well, you can be sober and you can go to AA, and I think I'm actually very pro 12-step programs for people. I think that we need supports. But there are people who still don't live a full life, even though they've abstained from their substances, or if they're not doing what's doing, or kind of been dominating their lives. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of recovery, I think, comes into that idea, a little bit even of a spiritual path in some places, of that full life, right? So the definition of self-driven life, and I suppose I need to kind of get a little bit more to the point, self-driven, self-directed lives, kind of getting to the idea of not being controlled by something else. Right.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, from a person of faith perspective, my goal is for people to find freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that it might be through Jesus. Mm-hmm. AA talks about God as we understand it, mm-hmm. right? Something is spiritual there, mm-hmm. right? I believe that we all have free will, mm-hmm. but that will is taken by a substance, by mm-hmm. something that we are dependent upon.
Yeah.
Right? And so addiction's not just, oh, you've got this problem, or a chemical dependence. It's your self-will and a lot of your ability to have your own agency, or even just self-determination is taken away. And so there's obsession, there's compulsion, there's this need to do, and you can't even explain why.
And I think that that's really what I've talked about before with this feeling of powerlessness. I think a lot of mental health problems, just a lot of problems in general, come when either we are powerless or we feel powerless or believe that we're powerless. And that's, I think, what you're getting at there, especially with the principles from AA, is that there's a higher power. You need more than just yourself mm-hmm. to get your autonomy back, basically. Yeah. And that's something that the devil uses to, it's one of his primary strategies, through fear and anxiety, is to make us think that we're out of control, that we don't have self-control, self-responsibility.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about some stats, or do you want to go into what you're thinking about, like your theory of how everybody is kind of in recovery?
Well, I think let's go with the stats, because that's dry. Not everybody's going to hear that, but I think there's some severity to that stat.
Okay.
Right, so we've seen a massive rise. We can go all the way back to 2008 to 2010 in other fields, looking at need for access to mental health, right? I didn't really get into any of my background, but I've worked with a lot of adolescents, and we've seen a skyrocket, not skyrise, buildings versus graphs. But you've seen this huge rise in kids struggling with suicide, kids struggling with substance abuse. And a lot of those statistics have been seen, and I think there's some very unfortunate social reasons for that, starting in about 2010. But to not overdo the point, I just went back to 2018, right? Mm-hmm. Because the substance use numbers are similarly trended up.
Okay.
Right. So, excuse me. So, I'd love to give 2023 and 2024 numbers, but they're just not quite out yet.
Okay.
But just for some perspective, people hear about the opioid epidemic. You hear about, whether it's controversial legalization of substances, or some countries, Portugal's kind of the flagship for that historically, that they legalized all drugs, and they've had a massive drop in access and addiction numbers, and some of the criminology that goes with unfortunate use. You can make your own judgments on what's happened in the US in that, but it hasn't worked as well.
Okay.
So go for the big picture in the US, in 2018, we had approximately 21 million individuals who were identified as substance use disordered, right? That includes alcohol and all drugs. 21 million people in 2018. In 2023, so we do have numbers on that, 48.5 million.
Wow, so it's more than double.
More than doubled in 5 years. There's probably a few global reasons for that, but what I also see is this lack of hope, right? This loss of purpose, this loss of direction, and we can get into some of the reasons behind, or my opinions on some of that momentarily. But so that's just the addiction numbers. Then you hear about the opioid crisis and overdose deaths. So it's similarly tragic. In 2018, there was about 70,000, not 70 million, 70,000 individuals in the US who lost their lives due to overdose. That's not small. In 2022, it was about 108,000.
Wow.
And the hard numbers aren't there, but the estimated numbers for 2023 were 110. And so expected that trend up. Fortunately, I can say it looks like that trend's a little lower, based off of what NIH and a few other, and CDC are saying, but it's still in that 110 to 112 range.
Wow.
There was projected by 2025 we could have up to 120,000 people lost due to overdose death.
Wow.
And I'm not gonna get political on that conversation. It's more a hope and a lives lost, right? We're talking about people here, it's not numbers. And so what's going on in people's hearts and their minds and their lives that is leading to that kind of a tragic loss of life. So most people, and the reason why I bring in the statistics is because I don't really like to be the numbers guy. I'm a one-on-one person, right? Or, sometimes large groups, but it has to be personal, right? And we can get into kind of what some of my recommendations for recovery are, we'll get there. But when you're talking about doubling or a 30,000 person jump per year in people losing their lives, there's something's got to change. And I think it really comes down to not necessarily how many things we can throw at it. I think we've mitigated numbers of loss due to implementation of programs, specifically with opiate crisis using Narcan, police agencies, hospitals, first responders, but your average citizen can actually have a naloxone kit that can reverse an opioid overdose, which is great. And I think that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing numbers get a little lower, is implementation of programs. It takes time.
Yeah.
And I was briefly part of one of those programs, but how they roll out and even how global things impact those things long term, it can slow rollouts down. I think education of what to not do is important. So when we're talking about the number of overdoses from 2018 to 2024, we can all say what happened in 2020, right? People lost a lot of hope during certain times and forget the political end of it. Like when we're isolated, we're alone. Lots of things start to get out of hand and lots of hope is lost. So we saw a huge spike in overdose deaths in Michigan alone. Sorry, gotta unlock my phone for the statistics, but so in Michigan, in 2018, we had 2,035 overdose deaths. As of 22, we had 3,095. So in 4 years, 1,000 more people annually were lost.
Wow.
I don't like that.
Yeah.
And with all of that comes fear, comes stigma, comes judgment, right? And that's more, I think, what I'd rather speak on is less about the numbers and more about kind of what people go through and whether it's the person who's struggling with addiction or the family around them or the people who love those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's got to be personal. It's got to be a relationship.
Yeah.
That's how we're designed. We're relational beings. And so a lot of people do try to find answers in politics or, strategies or things like that. And some of those things can be good, but what it really comes down to at the end of the day is connections and support, because you can't do life alone.
Right.
You definitely can't do addiction alone.
No.
So.
Well, you do addiction alone.
You're right.
You definitely do that alone.
Not recovery.
The recovery, it can't be alone, which is an interesting topic. And I think it's hard for a lot of people, and that's kind of something I'm pretty passionate about when I work with people that lack of better term clients, but people that I work with.
Mm-hmm.
It's different, and I didn't really go into a lot of the detail, but I've worked with, I counted it off, in specific to substance use or largely substance use programs. I've worked with 5 different programs in my career. I've moved a lot, but for good reasons, and I work with fewer people in my outpatient practice than I did. I've worked with substance-specific IOPs, which is intensive outpatient program. Sorry, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Or when I was in Alaska, there was substances rampant there.
Yeah.
Right, and it wasn't a recovery program, but the tools and things that we start to learn about how to help somebody, and ultimately, there's one of the big things that I saw was how to come around somebody as a community, right? In a different area, there was a lot of restorative justice going on with the program we were working with. If somebody did something wrong, it wasn't punitive, it's how do we restore them to our community.
Yeah.
And that's something I think that's oftentimes lacking in how recovery works, how supports work, because how big is your boundary, right? Or do you push somebody away, or do you continue to enable them in their illness? So it's a big topic. I don't think we're going to get through all of it today, for sure.
Yeah. Well, so I want you to go into now kind of how you think everybody is kind of in recovery, how we all struggle with different types of kind of experiences that might be similar to addiction.
Yeah, so I think I shot you the line of everyone is in recovery. I have to disclaimer that because that's not an original to Joel statement. I heard it first and I was like, that's really great. There's actually there's a church down in Austin, Texas called Watermark. They have their own recovery program, and one of theirs, it's called Regen.
Okay.
I'm not plugging Regen here, but it's a really good one. But theirs is not just a recovery specific model, it's actually discipleship. Part of it, from my interactions with it, I think it breaks down the formalization of a support group, whether it's AA or Celebrate Recovery. I don't want to get into too much of their program's history because it's really good, but and then integrating people in a faith base, right? So my interactions with Matt down there, they want to think of it more as a discipleship program, but for people.
Yeah.
So the idea of everybody's in recovery, right? If we think about it, I've got coffee in front of me, right? There's a very large portion of our country that would say, I'm addicted to coffee. And we say it flippantly, like, I have to have this, or I'm craving this, or, this is my guilty pleasure, or whatever, right? Like,
well, coffee drinkers are cool. I don't drink coffee. I'm not as cool. So.
it's brown water, but I like it. Ethiopia coffee is the best. I got a chance to have some actually indigenously last year. It's way stronger than the stuff we're drinking.
Really? So you're a coffee snob then?
No, I'm a connoisseur.
A connoisseur, okay.
No, I'm not. I will drink a lot of coffee as long as it's not on a burnt pot in a workroom. I'll generally give it a pretty fair shake. But I like tea too.
Yeah.
It's generally, if it's liquid, I enjoy it.
Yeah. So we
So
all
where we
kind of
going
have
with
these.
that?
We all kind
Yeah.
of have these things that we like, rely on or
Yeah.
do regularly, and we kind of joke about being dependent on them. But maybe that's more real than we think.
Yeah, and I think kind of the idea of, I threw out some statistics on how severe the situation is, but like if we take it down to an everyday life, and let me back up one more step, is one thing that people who are in early recovery or even just thinking about getting clean or sober or are just wrapping their heads around the idea of never using a drug again is fear. They don't know how to share that with somebody, right? Because there is stigma, right? And I'm gonna say some things that aren't super nice here,
That's
but
okay.
like somebody will call them a junkie, the dregs of society, somebody who's not useful, weak, whatever. Like there's stigma that's associated with addiction. And that's kind of my point, is let's challenge that, because what is somebody who's not like formally addicted to a class 1 drug or not an alcoholic, and getting somebody even to admit or acknowledge that they have a drinking problem is a big deal. And it takes a great deal of revelation, hopefully not too tragic, but honestly I think it does take that.
Yeah.
And so people are afraid to even share that, and so how do they find support? How do they find acceptance and love? Right? I mean, we're with hope and wholeness, right? How do we find hope and wholeness if we're afraid of something? And so I've come across kind of the idea of 3 different people that we might encounter in recovery, and that's the one who's still in active use. I mean, hey, I'll have a cold one waiting for you when you come back, or we'll be waiting for you because this stuff you're not gonna like that. You're gonna want to come back with us. That's pretty sinister, but there are those out there. People in recovery should completely stay away from those types of people. You might also get the ones that like, you're an addict, what kind of loser are you? Right? Psh, you're weak. I've heard it. Why would you work with those people? They're useless. Well, they're not. And then the other ones are, and I think this is the vast majority of healthy people that somebody will come across, that when they hear you don't drink anymore, like, wow, that's amazing. Right? That must be really tough, but it takes a lot of strength to do that. And I think that's the type of people that you're looking for. And then maybe I said 3, but maybe there's the 4th that are just like, I have no idea what to even do with a person who's got that kind of background.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of why we're here, right? And so the thing to think about is what's taking up our time, right? I think you talk a lot about like what's dominating our lives, what's driving us, right? And many of us have things that are obsessions, compulsions, something that while we don't think about it, it controls us, right? I just got to get home and do this, or I just have to do this in order to feel okay.
Yeah.
And that's why I want to open people's eyes up to saying, okay, we all have brokenness. The Bible would call it sin. I use brokenness more often because that sin word makes us think, bad things.
Right.
But we're all broken. We've missed the mark of perfection. We've missed the mark of what God's plan for our lives has been. But in that brokenness, can we recognize it? Can we say, okay, I need something because this, right, the definition of self-directed living, right, free choice, God-ordained free choice for us. But what's keeping us from doing that? Is it, I'm touching my phone first to keep on point, but is it shopping? Is it food?
Yeah.
Right? Something that drives us. I mean, taking the gloves off, how many people are struggling with hiding pornography addictions? A lot. And yet we'll judge somebody who unfortunately the thing that's controlling them right now is something that they're putting in their body.
Yeah. I think that one thing that our listeners should pay attention to is how often they use the language of I can't or I have to.
Yeah.
Because this is language that a powerless person uses. And I do it all the time too. And it doesn't always mean that you're a powerless person if you use this type of language, but pay attention to how many times in a day you say, oh, I can't do that. Or, oh, I have to do this. And the reality is that we can, but we are choosing not to. And oftentimes we're being significantly influenced by, and we're giving a lot of power and control to something in our lives that probably shouldn't have that much power and control.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are kind of like some pointers or reminders that you want to get into about recovery and the term relapse?
Right. So relapse is a big word for anybody. It's not, well, again, backing it up, I do that a lot. It just is what it is. I think too far ahead and have to reel it back in, and I'm not even a fisherman. So there's other places in life where we have a relapse, right? It's most commonly heard about in addiction, but it's a medical term, right? If someone has cancer and they're in remission, but it comes back, it's relapsed.
Yeah.
Right. We may make a decision and we turn around and go do the same thing again. That's a relapse. And so, for people in addiction and in recovery, relapse is a really scary word. It's something that I think a lot of people have like as this giant monkey on their back of what's going to happen when I relapse, or I can't do this because it's inevitably a relapse, right? So there are a lot of different historical models of addiction. I think the most accurate one that we've worked with so far is the medical model, right? The disease concept, that addiction is a disease, and that's a whole other conversation. But it's accepted, and I think it is, right? We can compare it very, very clearly to, as I said, cancer or diabetes.
Yeah.
That's probably the most one-to-one comparison of like something that you didn't even try to do, and you got it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the idea of relapse, so it simply means some things are a big R relapse, some things are a little R relapse. It means you were on a path and you went back to what you were doing before, right? It's kind of the opposite idea of repentance, or it is actually repentance, right? Like you turned around and you went and did the other thing, and you need to turn around and do it again. So for people who have a bit more of a faith space or vocabulary in that, it's kind of the opposite. But so because addiction is considered a chronic relapsing condition, that's the thing that I think we need to kind of open up with for both the individual who may be struggling with addiction, who's finding recovery, as well as the people in their lives who love them.
Yeah.
Because sometimes supports are withheld out of fear of a relapse. Sometimes supports are way too concerned about preventing a relapse, which we should do relapse prevention. I mean, that's largely what we want to do. I prefer to think of sobriety support, right? It's more of a positive flip, so we're not always looking at what the bad thing is going to be. Let's look at the good things.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea of a slip up.
So I think that something that's important to think about here is that relapse is a really normal, it's an expected part of recovery. In fact, might some even say that a relapse is almost necessary to get to recovery?
Some might. I know anecdotally 2 people who have not formally relapsed, and one of them has 33 years. Well, last I talked with her, it was 33 years.
Okay.
So it's really cool.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have to relapse. But the likelihood of it happening is there, right? It is not an inevitability, but it is a possibility, if not even a probability.
Yeah.
So,
and relapses are a part of progress sometimes, which is really hard for people to accept that or understand that, both if you're in an addiction or if you're one of the support people, is that it's really hard and it feels like a setback, but it's actually part of normal progress most of the time.
And if we spin it that way, I think, not spin it, if we actually explain it that way, the fear is that you only have to relapse once, and that can go one of 2 ways, right? Some people relapse and never come back, unfortunately. Right? Those numbers say sometimes a relapse is fatal. Other people relapse and learn, as you said, right? And so I've kind of come up with, you remember the old recycle, renew triangle? I have my own relapse triangle, which is in the positive. I have a negative relapse triangle too, but let's not talk about that one.
Okay.
But I say, when it comes to relapse, you can regroup, relearn, and renew.
Okay.
Right? And so the regroup is simply, well, you have to set up beforehand. You have to have people who you can trust and who you can bring in. So it might be 2 or 3 people. So how we set up the support group, it could be going to a 12-step group or a church group, Celebrate Recovery, or really any group of people who you can be accountable to. Right? Some people have accountability groups, some people have their AA or NA groups. And the ease of that is having a part of your support structure being people who have been in it before, right? Who do know what you're going through. Because some of the barriers come down, you're like, yeah, okay, I've been through exactly that. I understand. We need somebody who can empathize with us and can actually relate. But we can't only be in that. Otherwise, we'll fear the people who are the clean people, or the people who aren't like me, right? Well, you don't know what I've been through unless you've been through it. No, but I can still love you. Mm-hmm. And I can still support you, sometimes hold you accountable, always be in your corner, right? And so supports, I think, are one of the number one things, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody relapses, there's this tendency, one of the negative R's would be to recoil. The hidden relapse is one of the worst you could possibly ever have, right? I'm not going to go into the stories of those, but I've got a few that I'm thinking of. I can see their faces right now, who held it back and held it back. They talked to their therapist, me, or the support group that we were in, but they wouldn't tell their family. They wouldn't tell their loved ones. And after a couple of those, despite us saying, hey, you need more support here, unfortunately those became one of those statistical numbers. I can think of 2 of their faces right now, because that's the way it goes, right? They're people, they're not numbers. So the idea of the regroup is, rather than recoiling and saying, okay, well, I can't tell somebody because I've failed this many times, right? The one I'm thinking of, he's like, well, I've been to 10 programs, right? I can't tell my family that I've failed at another one, which we were like, you haven't failed, you're still here today.
Right.
How can we help you learn? So that's the second R, is relearn, right? What are the things that led up to a relapse, right? We'll talk about what's a setup behavior, or what's maybe even some signs that you're starting to slip into setup behaviors. Setup behavior being something that, an actual action that put us in a situation that resulted us in either kicking off not a trigger necessarily, but putting ourselves in a position to start that obsession cycle, right? So triggers can happen all day, every day. For somebody who struggles with alcohol, watch a football game. Nowadays, you can even attribute that to gambling, because I don't think there's a single program that's not talking about gambling on sports. It's taken a lot of the joy out of it for me. So there's triggers all over the place, right? But how are setup behaviors too, right? So a setup behavior could also be something we're not doing, like not going to a 12-step group, right? Maybe somebody does really well with 3 days a week and they've cut back to 1. And then after that 1, they go to every other week. And then they're like, yeah, I just don't go right now. And they haven't relapsed yet, but they're not continually exercising kind of that recovery fitness.
Right.
So that's kind of the idea of the setup behavior. And so a support member, whether it's a support group, sponsor, or a family member, can say, hey, like, what's going on here, right? Not even necessarily, well, I think you're at risk, but sometimes you need to be pretty bold.
Yeah.
And say, you haven't gone in a couple weeks, I'm kind of worried. Is there something that we need to talk to you about?
Yeah.
And then, so if that happens, sometimes there are those setups that we didn't even know about.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to relearn that, like saying, okay, this is what worked, and when this didn't happen, it's not working so well now.
Yeah.
What wasn't working, And so what do I have to relearn?
Yeah.
Right? Is it that I do need more community time? Right? I'm not somebody who says you need to go to an AA group every single day, right? Because that's potentially adding some codependence to somebody. Now, there are times when you should, right? I think early recovery, I do recommend people going every day for that support. You build a relationship, the frequency. But if it's also for each person what works for them.
Yeah.
Right? There are people who go every day for 20 years.
Yeah. Did you want to say something about the renew part?
Yes, I was getting there. So the renew is almost like once you've relearned, this is what I'd like you to think of. What are the positive parts of your recovery? Like a lot of times we think about, oh, I'll lose this, I'll lose this, I'll lose this, I'll lose this, but that's not gratitude. That's fear. In all of this, I like the analogy of, well, you ride bikes, right? I like family bike rides, and my kids are learning how to ride their bikes. We fortunately don't have this situation yet, but when you were a kid, did you ever toe the line of the curb? I don't know what you'd call it, but yeah.
I still do all the time.
Okay. What happens with that a lot of times?
You have a lot of fun, or you don't have a lot of fun.
Right, yeah. I've pitched sideways into the back of a car before. Because that curb, I was like going as far as I could to get to that curb, and went into the road instead of into the sidewalk side, and I mean that's a relapse, right? Like that's a train wreck. But it's like target fixation, right? Like I can ride a bike down a road just fine, or on a sidewalk just fine, and not really notice any sort of deviation. But then when you put it on this fine line of a curb, you're far more likely to actually be looking down at that off the curb, or like this is a really narrow way, and all of a sudden you fall off.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's even getting into that kind of idea of the inevitability, or even maybe the set of behavior, right?
Yeah.
Haven't quite figured out that part of the metaphor yet. But the renew function that I want people to remember is like, what are the things that build us up, right? It's not just what are the pieces of our supports, what are the groups that I go to, but why, right? Like, why do I love feeling like I don't have to have a hangover? Why do I love being able to have an open, honest conversation? We may not see the results right away, and so very simply, like the principle of recovery to focus a lot on is gratitude. But I'd like to take it a little step further, depending on the individual. What works for me doesn't necessarily work for everybody else, but there's also a spiritual component involved in recovery, right? And so it's not just like, okay, well, I guess I'll try again, right? Well, I won't say what Yoda says about trying, but
No, say what Yoda says.
well,
I love talking
do or
about
do
Yoda.
not, right? There is no try.
There is no try. Do
Right.
or do not. Because Yoda is a powerful person.
Yeah.
And he requires other people around him to be powerful. So don't try. Do.
Or do your kids ever take try bites of food?
Yeah.
It's not a good thing, is it?
Well, I mean, there's people will oftentimes say, like, I'm trying to be patient.
Mhm.
And usually I'll say, you either are or you are not. Are you being patient or are you not? Or some people will say, like, I'm practicing patience. I'll be like, no, you're not practicing patience, you are being patient.
Yeah.
And it's not automatically wrong, of course, to say I'm trying or I'm practicing. But yes, there is that, I think, really important.
I don't use either
Point
one of those.
there.
I excuse by saying I'm working on it. Because I know I'm going to fail once.
I'm going to add that one. If anybody of you say I'm working on it, that's also an excuse.
No, I can fight that one because I'm working on it, right? Like sometimes I make it and sometimes I don't.
Yeah.
Right? It's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the idea of the relearn and renew part.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are also going to be things, if we look back, and this is a little bit of a side, but I don't really make New Year's resolutions. Right? I try to, towards the end of the year, look back on the year for what I was grateful for. Right? Like, how far have we come? Right? A year is a very long time, and it's also a very short time. But a lot of growth can happen. So the renew thing, it's like I said, it gets a little more spiritual to me, and that kind of goes for each individual. I don't want to necessarily preach at somebody because I don't think that's necessarily the place. You have to find what is true and what is good. I know what I believe is true, and I hope that people find that.
Yeah.
But everybody's got to have a reason for why they're recovering, and they also have to say, okay, like, this is still good. It doesn't mean that, oh, I had 20 years and I relapsed, or I had 5 years and then I blew it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that is true to some degree, but it's not failure. I wouldn't even say you blew it, right? We had a relapse. It's part of the thing. So how do we then treat it? And then find some perspective so that we don't fall into the shame cycles. Oh, I should have done this, and what, like, now I got to start over. It's so hard. It is hard.
Yeah.
But it's still good.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go into some stuff about boundaries for people who are support people. So I think that in this particular area, there's a lot of times that people are really struggling with boundaries, because boundaries are saying yes and no to keep good in your life and keep bad out of your life. And what a lot of people will tell me about people who use substances that are in their life is that, well, sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, and what am I going to do? Have them over for dinner, and then when they start being, quote, bad or bringing bad things into my life, I kick them out, or, I want them in my life. I want them to not die. So can I give them a bed to sleep on tonight, or do I not? Mm-hmm. These are really, really tough questions. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people will actually start wondering, is a boundary selfish or not as well? What are some of your initial thoughts on boundaries with substance users?
I think it's case by case.
Of course.
Absolutely. There is that level of, because that's something that the support person might struggle with, is have they enabled something? Because another thing to think about is anybody in recovery, they're not the only one who's sick, right? It's not contagious. It's not going to make everybody else sick, but there's dysfunction that almost always occurs, right? Enablement, avoidance, and that sort of thing. And so there's a level of what are we committed to, right? And I think that's where I usually come more from the person who's struggling with the addiction and the recovery, but I do work with people who have loved ones in that. And so wrapping your mind around, again, the idea of this person is being controlled by something, right? I just had a conversation with somebody, not a client, last week that was like, well, why can they do so many bad things? Well, they're not living a self-directed life. They're being directed by a compulsion. Right? And so have some compassion there, but yes, there needs to be safety boundaries, right? Especially if you're considering letting somebody in your home, right? I think there's lines to be crossed, and everybody has to make their boundary, right? Like what we've talked about, I like the idea of the farmer and the bull. I don't know if you use that analogy or not, but like, I don't think we'll have time for that, but like there's no trespassing signs, or in Michigan there's purple paint on trees. That's a whole other conversation, but it's a posted, do not pass this. If you see purple in consecutive tree lines, you probably should turn around and go the other direction. But that was really random. Again, it could probably go deeper. But so have you ever seen a don't trespass or bull in field sign?
Not a bull in field, but no trespassing, of course, I've seen.
Yeah, I've seen bull in field signs, maybe because I grew up a little bit more out west. But or you might see a beware of dog sign. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That might be more applicable. But I like the bull because a farmer puts up a don't go in this, because what can bulls do to people? Yeah. Mess them up pretty bad, right? They're going to gore them. The farmer does not care about Joe Blow walking down the street and being like, oh, hey, I think I'm going to climb this fence. And they don't care about that person. They care about their bull. Why? Because a bull is how you get more cows, right? Their bull is the most precious thing, right? They love their cows, but you don't get calves without a bull, right? So he's protecting his interest in that case, right? That's the point of the fence, the boundaries line. Please don't cross this. If you do, I'll have to do this. It's not a matter of I'm here to threaten you. It's there's something that is precious to me, and I don't know if bulls can get hurt if they gore a person. I would imagine they can probably hurt themselves if they ram you into a fence sometime. But the idea is he's not there to protect the person. He's there to protect his interest. It's not selfish. Like there are other things, it's livelihood and that sort of thing. And so when we're talking about our own boundaries, we have to say, okay, what's precious and important, right? So when it comes to even supporting somebody in addiction, what's precious and important? I don't want to build a resentment towards you. I don't want to have to kick you out. I don't want to throw you out on the street or call the police on you because I love you. So what do we need to do to make sure that we can still function in the same world? Is it, if you're using, you can't be on my couch, right? If you're clean, I'll trust you.
Those are tough boundaries.
It is.
You know, people in the throes of addiction are always, pretty much always, narcissistic. And what I mean by that is that they're self-seeking at all times, because what they have done really is they have made a substance their God. And so whenever anybody is in an addiction, they're not going to be in their right mind. They're not going to make any types of decisions that will benefit you or be helpful for the relationship. They're going to make decisions that benefit them and their addiction. That is their sole focus. A lot of people will kind of wonder, like, oh my goodness, is my addicted partner or my addicted friend, are they a narcissist? And oftentimes I say no, but they are at the moment. Because as soon as they're sober, usually that tends to decrease, and then it becomes this push and pull of, oh my goodness, look at this distinct different, this is crazy, and they don't know. They start losing trust in a person. But what I want to talk about really quick is, can boundaries be selfish? This applies to anybody in really any situation where they're in a relationship with somebody where they feel like that somebody is a little bit more of a taker and they're a little bit more of a giver. You know, and we are called as Christians, and many of the people you watching, whether you believe in Christianity or not, you probably have a big heart. Especially, I know a ton of therapists with big hearts. There's a lot of good people out there. But can boundaries be selfish? First, let's talk about the definition of a boundary. It's any structure that you put in place to keep good in your life and keep bad out of your life. So you can see how that might be selfish. If I say, if you say bad words to me, I'm going to slap you in the face. I'm trying to keep bad out of my life, bad words, and keep good in my life, you talking respectfully to me. And so these types of things, it can kind of seem like a boundary. But what I'll say is that let's call certain things what they are. People can do something manipulative, or they can threaten. I'm going to punch you in the face if you call me an angel. They can threaten, and that sounds like a boundary because I'm telling you what I'm going to do. It's something that I'm putting in place, something that I have full control over, which is my fist, whether or not I punch you in the face or not. But let's call it what it is. It's not a boundary, it's a threat. We have a lot of words that mean different levels of things. So I think that when people say I'm setting a boundary, oftentimes they're actually making a threat, or they're actually being coercive. So what I would say oftentimes is that a boundary is not a threat. I like to say a boundary is a promise. But a boundary is something that you tell somebody that you're going to do that doesn't compromise any of their rights or their value as a person. And it's something that you follow through on, that you say you're going to do, and then you do it. So manipulative behaviors, threatening behaviors, those are manipulative and threatening. So a powerful person is somebody who takes responsibility for their lives and makes choices to live the lives that they want to live. They're not interested in controlling somebody else. The purpose of the boundary is always to protect your own time, energy, and resources, and to use them wisely according to your values. So with a person who might be your son or your daughter, they are going to have probably increased access to your time, energy, and resources compared to somebody off the street. But if that son or daughter is showing over and over again that they're going to abuse and misuse your time and energy and resources, like if I give you an apple and you slam it down and stomp on it every time I give it to you, am I going to keep giving you apples? Like, I don't care who you are, I'm not going to keep wasting apples on you, right? So it doesn't really matter how close this person is to you if they're completely disregarding some of the time and the energy that you're investing in them. And so what do? You stop giving them apples, unfortunately. And is that selfish because you're keeping more apples to yourself? No. You are using your time, energy, and resources wisely. So, okay. So a healthy boundary was somebody who, say, calls you names. is to respond with something, is to walk away, because that's what you have control over, is yourself, and to say, I'll be happy to speak with you and connect with you when you're not calling me names.
Yeah.
You are keeping the door open, but you're putting it on them. When you can behave respectfully, I'll be happy to connect with you and have a relationship with you. And some people, in my life, I don't think I've ever really cut anybody off.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that have come into my life and then gone out because they don't want to honor the boundaries I put in place.
Yeah, and I would say I would agree. I'd never fully ever cut someone off or put them out of my life, but there is times where you really need that large break.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm thinking of somebody specifically right now in my own life that I'm not going to go into too many details, but it's a person who was struggling with active addiction in their life, who was a close person in my life, and I had to finally put up a boundary because they were actually saying things to other people in the support structure. Well, Joel said this, this, and this, and that's not true, right? And so for both personal and professional reputation reason sounds bad, but I need to put up a boundary because they were not being honest, and it was starting to affect other things.
Right.
And so it was formally, you know what, we need to take some space. If that person comes back, and I don't know if they will, I've chosen to not reach out because it's not a safe boundary. It also involves, safety of the children in my home, right? And that's a huge boundary because I'm protecting something.
Yeah.
Right? There was never any threat. It's just a matter of saying, okay, like, I think there needs to be some space here until you're able to.
Right.
To more appropriately engage in our relationship.
Yeah. So is it manipulation to basically tell somebody, like, hey, I can't be in a relationship with you until you're ready to be respectful, or until you, even if you say, like, until you have 6 months of sobriety or something? Is it manipulation in that case? Because you're trying to you are kind of trying to encourage them because you want to be in a relationship with you. So you're kind of like putting on them, like, I'll give you a reward if you are sober
and
for 6 months.
the timetable one is difficult simply because everybody's recovery is different, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's scientific reasons why, like, the first year there's the risk for post-acute withdrawal syndrome, right? There's personality and brain changes going on. So 6 months is a really short time in the recovery world, but it can be a really good time if somebody's engaging. And so that kind of gets into, again, like, what somebody realizing. I think you skipped something kind of important is looking at some of the motivations and some of the triggers that result in whether relapse or use, right?
Yeah.
And that can go for even, is the person who is at risk of having weak boundaries or enabling providing some of these things, right? It's kind of, I call them my 4 F's, right? It's your fix, your fit, your fill, and your feel, right? So there are external triggers, there's internal triggers, there's the things that, what's driving us, what do we need to control, right? Somebody who's struggling with addiction is actually not out of control necessarily. Mm-hmm. Much of what they're going through is trying to put too much control on something, whether it's to fix a problem, right? I think when we're talking more like in the substance abuse, like experimentation, like the fitting into a particular group, it seems like a younger thing, but when we're talking about where we stop growing, like, we're still trying to fit into, like, I'm the black sheep in my family, or I don't fit into this group and I've always needed to fit into that group, kind of a thing. But the deeper one is, what am I trying to fix in my life, right? It could be a trauma, it could be a brokenness or an identity thing, right? That results in, well, I can't figure this out, and so I feel like it goes away when I do this, right? Or what's the emptiness? You and I know what the emptiness is, but I'm trying to fill something, and no matter what I put in and put on it or put in myself, it doesn't fill it. And so, but even some of those things can continue to be dragged out when there's that continual kind of enablement cycle, right? And so sometimes we have to say, okay, I'm not going to let you do this, this, and this in my life because you need to figure out this, and this in your life for yourself, right? Recovery can't be to an ends to a mean. Like, I can't recover for my kid, or you can't recover for your wife, or whatever. It has to be, we have to find that self-driven actualization. And I think really, truly, who does God say we are?
Yeah. I mean, you're highlighting some of the complexities that go along with setting boundaries and things like that. And it is complex, and I don't want to oversimplify it too much, but I do want to really let you all know that boundaries are oftentimes not selfish. I'm going to give you some tips for basically evaluating if your boundaries are selfish or not. First of all, boundaries can definitely be selfish, and I would say that this happens when a person's core values are self-centered. So if your core values, are God, family, work or something like that, and these are the things that the lens that you filter your life through first, having God and a biblical understanding of God is going to have you care about other people too. Putting your family first, sometimes even putting your work first, means that all those things have to do with relationships. But if a person has themselves as their first priority or their first value, then pretty much all their boundaries are probably going to be selfish. But let's go in the direction of assuming that most of you probably have a healthy first few priorities to filter your decisions through. Then here's a couple of things that you can do to determine if your boundaries are selfish or not. Number one, check to see if they are congruent with your values, because sometimes we'll set a boundary that's not congruent with our values, not congruent with our priorities. If I say something like, if you do that again, I'm going to smack you, this is in contrast to anyone who has the core value of like respect for others or not harming others. Okay, another second thing that you can do is ask yourself who you're trying to control. If you're trying to control other people, if it's more about this person has to do this so they can be in my life, and not as much about what I want in my life and what I don't want in my life, then that's a potential indication that your boundary could be selfish. We're not trying to change others, and boundaries are not an attempt to change others. Boundaries communicate what your priorities are and what you want in your life and what you don't want in your life. And oftentimes, we have to say no to a lot of good things in order to live the life that God has called us to live, or to live according to our purpose and our values. And then I'll say one more thing. For those of you who are oftentimes considered maybe givers, I would say that anytime you are doing something for someone else that they are capable of doing for themselves, that is a really good indication that that boundary is enabling somebody else. Anything that a person can do for themselves, oftentimes they ought to be doing it. We are actually potty training my little girl right now. Well, actually, we started potty training her like a couple months ago. Yeah. And she's been doing pretty good for the most part. But she's been kind of going through a little bit of a regression, and it's like, she's like, I gotta go potty all the time. And we're taking her to the big potty, and we're picking her up, and we're sitting around the potty, and we're doing all this stuff for her. And sometimes she goes, and sometimes she doesn't, and sometimes she pees herself. And we're like, what in the world is going on here? And Candy's like, well, you gotta stop enabling her. I'm like, how are we enabling her? And she's like, we're walking around, following her around, checking on her, asking her if she has to go pee all the time, blah, 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 blah. We're like basically doing all the work for her, and she's not even paying attention anymore. Yep. Because she was doing really good before. And so I was like, I'm looking at my wife with these crazy eyes. Well, what do you suggest? Yeah. And she's like, she only goes in the little potty from now on, and we just leave it right here in the kitchen. Anytime she has to go, she goes, and we don't even ask her if she has to go anymore. I'm like, well, what if she pees herself all over the place? She's like, that's her responsibility. Right. She can pee for herself. This potty she can get on herself. She can get off herself. She can wipe herself. So this is what we're gonna do. And I love that little example, because how many times in our lives are we doing something that we think is good for somebody else, but we're actually doing something as basic for them as wiping, or asking them, do you need to go to the bathroom or not? We have to let people have responsibility for the things that they can do for themselves.
Yeah, and being able to have that, actual accomplishment, right? It is a great example to use a childlike development in any sort of recovery life, except we're dealing with full-grown adults, right? And so, again, there's so many different conversations here, but the idea of, okay, over-enabling also builds a big sense of shame in a person. It's like, oh, I can't do this. I don't have agency. I'll never be able to do this. And that's a setup for the more negative 100%. Stuff we didn't talk about. But so then saying, okay, I'll help you along the way a little bit, but there are things you can go do. And so being strengths-based, being saying, okay, what are the good things in your life, your abilities, the things that you still see? And it's tough, it's scary for somebody to say, okay, well, I've got this many years, or I don't know how to do this. And you know, that there's also how everybody involved in this whole conversation supports, as well as the person probably should have a therapist themselves. Right? That's not necessarily a plug, but like
Joel's available, everybody. I'll plug him.
Look at my schedule. But what I'm saying is, you know, there are people who come in with the support person, like, well, this person needs counseling, and I usually ask them in the first session, like, are you in counseling yourself? Right? Or if maybe not first session, but a couple times down the road, like, hey, like, have you thought about this? Because it's not shifting blame onto the support people. It's saying, like, there are things you need to work through, and they may be uncomfortable for you to have to address as well. Because like I said, everybody in the whole thing is affected by a dysfunction.
Well, support people do need counseling pretty much 100% of the time, in my opinion, whether they need it for themselves individually or just to determine healthy boundaries and healthy relation structure with that person in their life who's in recovery. So we got to wind down here, Joel. So let's kind of summarize some of our main points and maybe try as best we can to share some of them concisely. I'll say, you know, one of the biggest things that I want to give you guys as a takeaway in terms of boundaries is boundaries are not selfish. Oftentimes a rock bottom experience is necessary, it's needed for a person, and it's not your fault that somebody else chooses or is going through a rock bottom experience, and it's not your job to bring them out of it. Are there ways that you can help? Yeah, sometimes there are. A lot of times there are, but it's not your responsibility. And I think that sometimes when we act out of things being our responsibility, we overact. That's one takeaway on boundaries. Joel, what do you
I think for
takeaways?
For people who are struggling or in active recovery, right? Either you're just realizing, hey, I might be addicted to this, or you have already started the process of the very admirable road of find people in your life, right? Don't suffer in silence. Don't fight it out. Don't white knuckle it. It doesn't have to be a 12-step if that's not your thing, because I know that's not the thing for everybody. But find people who you feel you can trust. There are a lot more people out there who actually are proud of you for being clean and sober. You don't have to live in fear, because fear makes us sick.
And we like to say that, you know, the 12-step program isn't for everybody, but I'll say that some type of program with support and accountability is for everyone, and that you're probably not going to want to do any of them, but you got to take that step.
I mean, I had he's passed now, but one of my mentors in my very first therapy program, he was 15 years clean and sober, and he was very much 12 steps early on, and he also was a person of faith, and he added in all of these. He was a deacon eventually, he was in a small group, he was in a choir, and he realized for him, partly because there's some professional roles involved too, but those were the things that he gravitated towards. What I'm saying when we talk about support groups is, you're right, it's not necessarily a formal 12-step group, but who are we accountable? Who can we be honest to? It could be one, or I would say 2 or 3 people, not just one go-to. Because if we're like, all right, Bob's not here, what am I going to do? Well, maybe call Steve, right, or Kevin. Right. And
you gotta have other people in your life.
And for supports people, and we talked about supports, I think for somebody who looks with judgment on others, right? If you're hearing this and you're like, well, I'm still not buying in this, I'm not judging you, but we have to all look and see what areas we're struggling with. Is there something that is controlling me? Is there something that I am putting far too much of my time in at the cost of real, true, abundant God-honoring life.
Yeah. Is there something that is causing you to say I can't or I have to, or something that you are spending a lot of time pursuing that maybe doesn't deserve such a large place in your life?
Yeah.
Yeah, be aware of that. All right.
Yeah.
Any other big takeaways?
None coming to mind.
Okay.
Thanks for your time.
All right, yeah, well, thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Make sure to submit some questions, comments to our email, which is hwpc.podcast@gmail.com. Also, you can find me and Joel on our website, hopeandwholenesspsychology.com. You can submit questions on Facebook or YouTube, so can't wait to hear from you all.
Thanks.